Hello everyone, my name is John, I'm the Geeky Fanboy, and welcome back to me talking about books. This time I'm gonna casually take you through everything I read in January 2024. This is the first time I'm doing this kind of format, so let me know if you would like me to do this more often. This January I actually read quite a decent amount of books and comics, etc. That's not always the case. I was quite fast this month, so there's a bit more on here than I normally read on average in a month. But we're not looking at numbers anyway. If you're reading, you're reading. That's all that matters. That's good. And with all of that out of the way, let me remind you the kind of things I'm talking about when I say what I read. I'm going to talk about books I read in English, books I read in German, because I live in Germany and I do try to read German books. And I also read comic books and manga, so I'll mention a couple of those as well. In fact, I'll probably talk about a bunch of comics. That's why my average number on books read in January is a little high, because I did read a bunch of comic books and manga. But like I said, if you're reading, you're reading. Everything counts. So with all that out of the way, let's grab some tea or coffee. I also have some biscuits. So let's just jump straight into it. So we're doing this in chronological order, and the first book I read in January, which I literally finished on the 1st of January, was Avatar: The Last Airbender, The Search. So this is a comic book that's already quite a few years old, but in December or November-December, I did another rewatch of Avatar: The Last Airbender and Legend of Korra. And then I headed into the bookshop, and I saw that they had some of the Avatar comic books. I'd never actually read any of those. So some of you might remember that I talked about Suki Alone in my wrap-up for 2023. And The Search I basically picked up right after that. So The Search, I think, is a quite popular and famous Avatar comic, because this is the comic book that tells you about what happened to Zuko's mum. So minor spoiler, I guess, if you haven't seen the cartoon yet, but the mystery of what happened to Zuko's mom is quite a big thing that gets teased quite heavily throughout the show, especially at the very end of the show, but it's never really addressed within the show itself. And then a bit later we got this comic book, and this comic book is set a short while after the original cartoon is finished. And basically this is about Zuko wanting to find out what happened to his mother. And they decide, like the gang, they try to do that by teaming up with Azula. So Azula has been imprisoned. We all know she was mentally broken at the end of the cartoon, which is still sort of persisting in this story. And the gang teams up with Azula to go and find out what happened to the mother. And we go on a classic like Avatar: The Last Airbender adventure. There are like some cool fights. There's some spirits from the spirit world that Aang has to talk to. Throughout the story we get flashbacks to what happened to Zuko's mum when she was younger, how she, where she grew up, in what village, like who was her first boyfriend, and then how she came to meet Ozai and came to be the wife of the Fire Lord. There's a lot of interesting stuff there going on, lots to do with politics as well. And then we sort of slowly, it's revealed to us within the flashbacks and within the present day story, it's revealed to us what has actually happened to Zuko and Azula's mother, and why she hasn't been able to see her children again. I don't really want to spoil the story, but I thought it was quite interesting. It was a story I wanted to hear and read for a long time, and I think this delivered a satisfying solution. It was a little too convoluted and too complex for its own good at times. Nevertheless, I thought it was quite interesting. It was cool to see what had actually happened to the mother, like in the flashbacks, and then to see sort of her, what has happened to her in the present day. And it was also especially interesting to see how Zuko and Azula deal with not only just having to hang out again, but specifically like in this relation to them as siblings and to their mother and their father. That was really quite interesting. The style of the comic book itself was also pretty decent. It's very close to what you know from the cartoon. I especially liked how the paneling worked when there was fighting. It was really quite dynamic. So this was definitely an early highlight for me, and I gave this comic book a 4.5. The next book I read was a book in a German fantasy series that I spoke about in my 2023 wrap-up. Namely, I read the third book in the Reckless series by Cornelia Funke, and this one was called The Golden Yarn. So I was quite disappointed with this one, to be honest, and I'm going to say right away, this is where I'll stop the series. So the series has more books. I think there are 4 or 5 at the moment. I'm not even quite sure, but I'm not going to read anymore. So the thing is, Cornelia Funke I quite like as an author. She has written some of my favorite fantasy books of all time, like the Inkheart series, and she is, in Germany at least, she's quite well known as a children's and adult fantasy author. And I absolutely adore her writing style. She has such a beautiful way of using words, like it feels very flowery and prosaic, but not too over the top. You can always quite, like, exactly imagine what's going on. Her worlds are filled with like so much attention to detail. Her world building is great. But I never really got into the whole premise of the Reckless books themselves, because there's just too much going on, not enough explanation, and there was never really that much for me to care for, like especially with the characters. They're all quite flat. There's nothing really there for me to care about. There are only like really 1 or 2 characters I sort of care about. And in this one, in the third installment, I really had a big problem with the story because there wasn't one. There were like so many POV jumps throughout the entire novel. Like you basically finished the first 10 chapters and you got 10 POVs. That's essentially what this book read like. Up until like 3/4 of the way through, I had no idea what the actual plot was supposed to be, what the golden yarn had to do with it. No idea. Then this book decides to introduce a love triangle, because for some really stupid reason the 2 main characters can't be together. So the 2 main characters are Jacob Reckless, and his friend Fox, who, like, she can change her form. She can change from being human into a fox, and that's why that's her name. And they've definitely had a crush on each other, like basically since the beginning of the series. And now in this book, it's heavily teased that they're gonna get together, but there's like a curse thing which basically says that even if they do get together, like, Fox will never be able to have children. And for some reason, that's the reason why Jacob decides he can't be with her. Like, that's his decision, and if that's the most important thing in the world, that she probably won't be able to have children if they do get together. I just didn't understand that at all. And then we get like the introduction of a third guy who has like a bit of a thing with Fox in this, and I didn't feel it at all. It was stupid. I think the third guy who's introduced in the love triangle might even have been called Tennant or something, and the whole time I just had David Tennant in my head, which in that case didn't really help. So yeah, I didn't vibe with this at all. The only thing that I really enjoyed about this was the writing style, and I liked like maybe 2 of the characters, but overall I didn't like this at all. I gave this 2 stars, and I won't be continuing this series. So next up, we're going to talk about some comic books. Bit of background story on that one. I finally managed to get my girlfriend interested in comic books, specifically DC Comics, and she really got attached to the character of Nightwing. So they asked me to like look for some comic books that they could get into. So I said, yeah, sure, I'm gonna look into that, and I can read them with you, so we have a bit of an introduction. So the next couple of things I'm going to talk about are Nightwing based comic books. The first one I read is Nightwing Year 1. So this is a short storyline from the original Nightwing 1996 comic book run. And basically it's all there in the title. Nightwing Year 1 basically tells the story of how Dick Grayson went from being the first Robin to becoming Nightwing. And I honestly thought that was quite a good introduction to the character of Nightwing, if you're not that familiar yet with comic books or the character himself. Because it really gives you like a basic overview of, okay, that's him as Robin, that's his relationship with Batman, that's sort of what his problem is with Batman as he grows up, as he's Robin, and this is what drives him to eventually become Nightwing. I thought that was like a good introduction, and the story, while quite fast paced, I think worked nevertheless. I like the comic book style as well. Like a lot of like dynamic paneling, especially like in the fighting and the gymnastics, which I think is a really important aspect, especially of Dick Grayson as a character, since, you know, he comes from the circus and all that. So I thought this one was quite a good introduction if you're looking yourself to like maybe get into some comic books or Nightwing. I can recommend this one. I gave Nightwing Year 1 a 3.75. After that, I read another Year 1 story. I read Robin Year 1. Which is by the same author. They're both by Chuck Dixon. Robin Year 1 was alright. I gave it 3 stars. Basically, this is more of like a background on Dick Grayson when he was still Robin, even though I would have wished for even more of a background, because it doesn't really talk that much about like Dick Grayson's past at the circus or with his parents, how he really came to be Batman's ward. It's more about like a defining storyline within Robin's first year. It has a lot to do with like Two-Face as well. So while it wasn't bad, it also wasn't like as good, I thought, as Nightwing Year 1. I did quite enjoy the art style in Robin Year 1, because it was very reminiscent of like the old cartoons, the very old first comic books, a bit of like the Adam West series in there as well as a style choice, which I thought was quite nice. I wouldn't say this is necessarily something you have to get into if you like want to read some Nightwing. I still think it's decent if you want a bit of background on the characters. So yeah, 3 stars was alright. And the next Nightwing story I read was Leaping into the Light. So this is a storyline from the Nightwing 2016 main series. So this is the first story of like the Tom Taylor run. Which is, I think, a good entry point into the series as well. It has a very good art style, it like flows really dynamically. It gives you like a really good idea of Dick Grayson's movement as Nightwing, since, you know, it's all based on acrobatics, since he's from the circus and all that. I think that worked really, really well, and this one also introduces you to like a couple of important secondary characters within Nightwing's universe. Like Batgirl, for example, is an important character in this, Batman as well, naturally. You even get cameos by like the Teen Titans, and this story even had me cry at the end, like just a little bit. I don't want to spoiler why, because it hinges on the death of a character, but it honestly got me a bit there at the end. Honestly, it got me. I thought this was really good. I think this is a great introduction if you're looking for not only introduction to Nightwing, but especially like if you want to not necessarily read the older stuff, but want to get into more of the newer stuff. I think this is a good entry storyline. It has some good action, sets up some interesting themes, I think, for Dick Grayson as a person, as a character, also him as a hero, also sort of paralleling his own status as a superhero with what Bruce Wayne, with what Batman does, which I thought was quite interesting. So I had a lot of fun with it. I gave it 4 stars. And I could very well see myself maybe continuing the Tom Taylor run of this comic book in the future. Next book, I don't want to talk about for that long, because it's this. And usual disclaimer, J.K. Rowling is twat. We do not support her transphobic views on this channel, nor do I financially support her in any way. This was merely a reread of a book I already own to finish the big Harry Potter reread I started a while ago. I already mentioned that in my 2023 reading wrap-up. So I finally finished my big reread. Don't want to say too much here. I think the last book is alright. I gave it a 3.75. If you want to hear my thoughts in more detail, go to my Goodreads or Storygraph accounts. I wrote like very detailed reviews for each book in the series. I think like the seventh book is alright. It's not my favorite. I think it's sort of on the same level as Goblet of Fire for me. There are things in this I really like. It's super emotional, of course, and I think it's a mostly satisfying ending to an overall okay series. Also has some elements I really, really don't like. How it deals like with some characters, how the book deals with death of certain characters, how it repeats story beats and all that. Yeah, that's sort of it. Like I said, you can read my detailed review of that on Goodreads on Storygraph if you want to, and I've already asked this over my community tab. You can check that out, or put a comment here on this video if you're interested in me doing like a big sort of Harry Potter retrospective review, because I've sort of been thinking about it since, you know, now I've finished this big reread and sort of might want to do like a big casual discussion retrospective review of the series. If that's something you're interested in, do tell me down in the comments below, or tell me over on the community tab where I put up a poll for people who are potentially interested in me talking about that. But yeah, 3.75 for Deathly Hallows. Let's move on. If you thought we were done with comic books, of course we weren't, because we have to talk about my man John Constantine, because I read John Constantine Hellblazer Dead in America. So I was really hyped about this one. For people who may have watched some of my other videos, especially about Legends of Tomorrow and all that, you may know that John Constantine is one of my absolute favorite fictional characters of all time. He's probably arguably my favorite comic book character. And when it was announced that there was going to be a new Hellblazer series, I was all over that shit. I was really, really hyped to get into this, because this new series is run by the same people who already had a Hellblazer run, I think 2 or 3 years ago, and that run was interrupted because of COVID. But it was a run I really, really enjoyed. So it's by Simon Spurrier and co. I don't remember the other names now. But I remember I really, really enjoyed that run. It was some of the best Hellblazer I had read. So when I found out that those guys are coming back to basically continue that run, because it's basically a direct continuation, I got so excited. And then I finally got my hands on this. And Dead in America Volume 1, pretty good, pretty solid. I gave it 4 stars, because for now it is good, but it's also only like just the introduction volume of this new series, so there isn't too much going on yet. There's a lot of like explanation, a little bit of recap from like the previous storyline, and a lot of setup naturally. But nevertheless, I think this worked really, really well. It's still as gritty and dark and filled with political commentary as we're used to from Hellblazer, and especially from like the previous run by the authors and artists. Like I get that the art style might not be something for everyone. It's quite unusual if you compare it to stuff like the Nightwing comics I read. It doesn't look like that at all. It's much more grittier, much more realistic, like even a bit, not ugly, but you know, sort of more realistic and gritty, and it doesn't always look pretty, but it works for the storyline we're exploring here, which is I think quite interesting. I think there's a lot of potential there for, once again, of course, absolute tragedy, because how can you have a Hellblazer story without tragedy, because Constantine can never catch a break. We also stick with some of the characters, some of the important secondary characters from the previous run, which I quite enjoyed. And there are also some secondary characters introduced for this story that I did not expect at all. Some quite big ones, like well-known ones. I don't want to spoil it here, but I got really hyped when I saw the appearance of a certain character, like from a quite well-known comic book series within the same universe. That got me really, really hyped, because when these two characters interact, it gets really interesting, and also gives you a moment of like, oh shit, things are getting serious. And I'm really looking forward to seeing where this continues. If you're a Hellblazer fan, and if you've had your eye on new stuff, definitely check this one out. Like I said, it's strong, but there are like little weaknesses throughout, because of course it's volume 1, it sets up a lot of stuff. But nevertheless, I think this is a great start to another Hellblazer series by Simon Spurrier and co, which I'm really looking forward to. Next up, I finished a book that I've had on my to-be-read pile for quite a while. Namely, I finished Murder Your Employer, the McMaster's Guide to Homicide. So this is a book by Rupert Holmes I bought purely based on, you know, it says Murder Your Employer Guide to Homicide. That sounds hilarious. Of course I'm buying that. So this book reads half like a manual and half like diary entries. It is very much presented as sort of a school manual that you get when you enter the McMaster's school, basically, for homicide. So the first half of this book focuses on mostly on one man who wants to murder his employer for being an absolute fucking wanker, like unredeemable, and fails, but then is given a scholarship to attend the McMaster School for Murder. And there he learns essentially how to become good at killing people. And the first half of the book is mostly like diary entries from the main character telling us what he experiences at the school, what kinds of classes he attends, who his fellow classmates are, who his teachers are, all that. Then the story also starts to focus a little bit more on two secondary characters, two women, one of whom is a famous actress, and the other one, I think, is more of a secretary. And they both want to, so the actress wants to murder her employer, who is an absolute disgusting pig of a director, or agent, I can't quite remember, like, sort of like all about, you know, Hollywood and how it's abusive towards women. And the other lady wants to murder her female boss, who's basically just an absolute bitch. So the story sort of mostly focuses on the guy character, but then also introduces the two women. And then the second half of the book, unfortunately, abandons the diary and manual style and basically just tells us in classic prose how these three attempt to murder their employer. So this book was okay, though quite disappointing to a certain degree. I ended up giving it 3 stars, which means it was okay, but I'm probably not going to reread it anytime soon, if ever. I like the premise. It is very self-aware. It has a lot of humor as well, and I did enjoy the, you know, the diary, and especially like the manual style when it came to that, which is why I was so sad that the book basically abandons that shtick throughout the second half of the book. The beginning of the first half of the book I also thought was way more interesting, not just because of that, but also because of that. The first half of the book way more interesting than the second half, because the first half, it plays a lot more like, you know, with the school setting, going to murder classes, getting to know other people who for some reason want to murder someone or want to murder their employer. You get to meet with some of the teachers, and it's a lot of fun to sort of like dig into this premise of this school setting and have this from the main character's point of view, who has no idea what he's really doing here, but is slowly sort of adjusting to this strange premise, but also sort of trying to maybe figure out where he even is. It is a bit slow in the beginning, like it takes a long time for like the main premise to really like kick in, but once it's there, once you're at the school and you get to know some of the other people and the classes, it's really fun. They like throw in not just some school settings, but also throw in like some fun games basically for the people to play. You also have like some antagonistic characters within the student body, which was quite interesting. So that was all fun and good. And then it comes to like the second half of the book, and the second half of the book basically focuses on our 3 main characters as they attempt to murder their employer. That's basically the entire second half of the book. And the second half of the book drags massively because it takes ages until anything interesting happens, because naturally there's a lot of setup, like all the plans are being laid out by all 3 main characters. How are they going to go about murdering their boss, and what like the planning is, the planning stages and all that. And it just took forever because it basically just, it sounds mean, but it basically just turned into a normal book, and that's not what I wanted, because the first half was like, you know, the interesting diary entries and the classes and the manual style, and you don't get that at all, which is why the second half of the book dragged on for so long. I really struggled through the second half of the book. Like I really had to force myself to like sit down and just read and keep going. Like I just, at some point my brain didn't even really see anymore or understand anymore what was going on. So like strong first half and the second half like really dropped for me. So this is why I ended up giving it 3 stars. It was alright, it wasn't terrible, but also wasn't as good as I had hoped it would be. It had a lot more potential, I think. If the premise speaks to you, maybe check this one out. Otherwise, you don't necessarily have to give this one a read. Next up, I finished an absolute favorite, an absolute classic. Namely, I finished The Fellowship of the Ring. So I started rereading Lord of the Rings quite a while ago, together with my girlfriend, because she's never read the books. Then we took a bit of a break, but I finally came back to it and managed to finish it. So Fellowship of the Ring naturally is the first book within the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Fun fact, the entire series wasn't actually meant to be a series. Tolkien wanted this to be one big ass book, but then, of course, as publishing and as marketing has always been, they were like, how about we turn this one book into 3 books? Because money and all that shit. So that's what happened here. So I don't even want to say too much. I also wrote a little review for that on my Goodreads and Storygraph. Also, what can you really say about Lord of the Rings? So I ended up giving this a 4.75 because Lord of the Rings is just a fantasy masterpiece, and Fellowship is maybe, I'm not quite sure, I'm in the middle of the reread. I'm like in the middle of 2 Towers at the moment. Fellowship might be my favorite. It's certainly my favorite movie. I'm not quite sure yet if it's going to be my favorite book within the trilogy as well. Because honestly, the only criticism I sort of have of this book is, yes, it is a lot of walking, which I don't necessarily mind. It's just that the entire first half is just the hobbits getting to Rivendell. The entire first half of the book is just the hobbits trying to get to Rivendell, and then the second half is finally all that stuff with the Fellowship, exciting. You get to meet a bunch of new characters, and then the Fellowship goes on the adventure, and Moria and Lothlorien and all that. Then gets really interesting. So like the first half is a bit slow. In general, I can totally understand why some people might have difficulty with this. Because yes, it is a lot of walking, but then you have to just treat this as, this is a fun adventure. This is what every fantasy, especially high fantasy story, is based on. This is what D&D is based on. This basically reads like a D&D campaign, which has usually a lot of walking because you're trying to get to a place to achieve something. And the way you can just tell how much like love and attention to detail Tolkien has put in the creation of this world. Like, this man essentially invented a bunch of really cool fantasy languages and then was like, oh, how about I'm gonna write a book so I can boast about my cool fantasy languages, and that's how Lord of the Rings happened. And you can really tell. Sure, there's some singing, there's some songs, there's some poems which might be a bit unusual, especially if you only know the movies. But they're all essential to the world of Middle-earth. Like, singing and poetry is really important to Middle-earth. That's also why a lot of these characters sing. And honestly, those poems and those songs are really, really beautiful. The writing in the entire book is beautiful. It has this early 20th or mid 20th century fantasy style, which is very prosaic and almost like old-fashioned and vintage, and sort of like very fairy tale-esque almost. It really feels like a bedtime, like an epic bedtime story. Like someone is telling you an epic story they've heard about that one time. That's really what this feels like reading. And there's such a vast amount of detail, not just for the world, but also for the characters. Like, every member of the Fellowship is a bit different. You can tell why they're there. You can tell why each and every single one of them wants to go on this adventure. Yes, sure, some of them get a bit more detail, because with this big cast of a character, you have to choose some favorites. So of course it's mostly Frodo, Gandalf, and Aragorn. Those are sort of like our 3 main leads. But nevertheless, every character gets moments to shine. Every character gets enough detail that you understand who they are, what their important ideals are, and just what they are about. And some of that stuff is also different from what happens in the movies. So what I would say is what I usually try to argue. Maybe with Lord of the Rings, watch the movies first, and then if you really, really like the movies, go and read the books. Because I can totally see why these books are a bit hard to get through. And they are maybe a bit tedious, especially for someone who's maybe never read high fantasy or like older fantasy. But nevertheless, if you're willing to like indulge in like sort of the origins of the origins of high fantasy, or just into a world that basically has laid down the foundation for what fantasy is now, definitely go and read Lord of the Rings if you haven't done that yet. fantasy masterpiece. The next book is a German book. I don't think there's an English translation for this one. So I read a biography by this actor. Some of you may know him from Dark, from the Netflix TV series Dark, where he plays, what's his character? I think Ulrich, that's the character he plays, like the cop in season 1 and 2. That's that actor. And I came across this book because my mother likes this actor, actually. Since, you know, I live in Germany and everything, and I saw the book and I was like, oh, it's actually written by him. Sure, I'm reading that. And it was actually, it was really interesting. I didn't expect it to be that well written as it actually was, especially since it also says on the cover that he's written it together with someone else, who I'm sort of assuming was his ghostwriter or something. But it was really interesting. Like, he talks a lot about his heritage, because he, as you might guess from the name, he has Italian heritage. So he has a German mother and an Italian father. And that sort of has had a big impact on his life, because he was teased and bullied a lot because of that, because he has a mixed heritage. So he got he got bullied a lot when he was a kid, and there was a lot of family trouble as well, because the father was abusive. There's a really, like, interesting but strange relationship description that he had of what his relationship with his father is like, because he talks about how awful he is, how abusive he is, and aggressive and violent, but at the same time that he also still loves him and hangs out with him. So that was really fascinating to read about. And then he talks about how he got into acting, and he highlights some of the movies he's been in. Like, he talks about Dark, he talks about, what else is there? He talks about Fantastic Beasts. He was in the 3rd Fantastic Beasts movie, that's why, as well, you might know him from. So that was really interesting to get into. So in case there's ever an English translation of this, or if you're able to read it in German, definitely go check it out. I thought it was quite interesting, and I ended up giving it a 4.25. And the next book I read because of this one, because the actor quite recently, I don't know, like 1 or 2 years ago, starred in a movie adaptation of the Stefan Zweig novel, The Royal Game, or Chess Story, depending on the translation. So I decided to read Stefan Zweig's Chess Story, which is quite fitting, because I wanted to read more classic books. And this is Zweig's most popular and well-known book. So Chess Story, or also known as The Royal Game, is a rather short book, like it's more like a novelette than an actual novel. Is about a nameless narrator who boards a ship, and together with an American friend meets up with a master chess player. And they try to defeat him and they can't. Then one day, as they set up a match against this chess master, a random stranger turns up and suddenly tells them how to win the game. And they're all like, who the hell is this guy? Why does he know all those rules of chess? Why is he so good at it? And then the stranger tells the narrator, and essentially the reader, what has happened to him, how he ended up being on that ship. And he talks about how when the Nazis came to occupy where he lived, he was imprisoned by them because he had information on, like, some important, like, money stuff that belonged to the state, and of course the Nazis want that money. So they took him in for questioning at first, but then they eventually end up imprisoning him in this one tiny little hotel room, and there he's mentally and physically tortured by the Nazis for months on end. And in order to keep himself sane, he eventually manages to get his hands on a book, and the book details a bunch of famous chess matches. And the stranger essentially becomes obsessed. At first, it's sort of like a way to keep himself sane, that he reads the book and learns how to play chess, and then sort of like even builds himself a little like chessboard and all that. But eventually, because also of the torture and the imprisonment, he goes insane, as he like loses himself in this analysis of all the chess games, as he keeps replaying those chess games inside his head, how he eventually sort of enters in a chess game against himself in his own mind. And it's essentially the story of a man who descends into madness in a black and white version of himself, you know, with this chess allegory. And at the same time, he is on this ship telling us this story, and at the same time he's like playing this chess game against another chess master, so there's a lot of parallels going on here as well. This was a quite fascinating story. Like I said, a short story which nevertheless does a lot with what it has, what it presents us. I wish it had been even longer, because there's so much you can analyze about this character who tells us this story, and how many like details and analogies and metaphors you could interpret like out of the story that he's telling us about what time frame we're in, considering, you know, it's about fascist Germany and all that, and the man descending into madness and sort of being occupied by madness or by the fascists, you know, all of that. And honestly, the book had potential to be even longer, but it is written in such a beautiful, interesting way. It achieves such a deep level of philosophical detail with a surprisingly simplistic writing style, I thought. So I end up giving this a 4.25. This was a really, really interesting book to get into. I could very well see myself rereading that one in the future. I also watched the movie I mentioned earlier, I think from 2021, which is also, while a more loose adaptation of the novel, I thought was nevertheless a quite good movie. So if you're on the lookout for classic books or German books, I can definitely recommend this one to you. I think it's quite well known, and I can very well see why. So, this is it. I'm still eating my biscuits. I haven't finished my coffee, but we have finished this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please do tell me down in the comments below what books you have read in January. Well, do you already have some early favorites, or were there some flops that you didn't like at all? Please do tell me down in the comments below. As you know, I always love to hear what you guys are reading. And if you have any thoughts and opinions or comments on the books and comics I've presented you here, please also do tell me down in the comments below what you thought of those. I'm always curious to hear what you guys are thinking about the stuff I read, and if we have differing opinions. I already mentioned it. If you are curious to read reviews on the books I read, or if you just want to, I don't know, take a look at what I'm currently reading, please feel free to follow me on Goodreads and or Storygraph. Links for those profiles are down in the description below. And as for now, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't done already. And I'll see all of you very soon. Goodbye.